Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online event looking at how to improve access to and uptake of innovative medicines. I'm Richard Murray, and I'm Chief Executive at the King's Fund, and I'll be chairing our event today. And let me begin it by thanking our event sponsor, Ipsen. Well, we've got a great panel of speakers today, and I'll be coming to them shortly, representing a whole range of perspectives. And I've also just checked, we've got a great audience too. So just under 700 people have signed up, representing a range of views from NHS commissioners, people from providers, patient representatives and charities too. So just a couple of housekeeping details. So this online event is live and will include both a panel discussion, which I'll come to in a minute, and a Q&A. And so you can start submitting your questions as soon as you like. You should be able to see a box to the right of the video, which is where you can submit your questions. And you can also vote on other people's questions, moving them up and down the ranking. Then we'll come to those after the panel discussion. We'll also be putting some poll questions to you. These will flash up at various points during the session to the right of the video, and do take part in those as well. You can follow the conversation on Twitter on #KFOnline. And we do recommend also that you look at the resource page. This is on the left-hand side. There's a menu with a series of options, and you can navigate to the resources page from there. So why are we here today? Well, innovative medicines can provide the opportunity to transform patient care, to transform pathways, and indeed, of course, critically outcomes. But there have been problems in access and uptake over many years. How do we improve that access, and how do we get uptake higher in a way that is both affordable and that supports an already overstretched health and care workforce? So today we'll discuss some of the current barriers to accessing new medicines, how to build on some of the great experiences in speedy access and uptake that we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course how to address inequalities in uptake as well. So let me start with our first question to the panel. Think about the current barriers to improving access, work that's being done to try and overcome that, and whether indeed there are lessons from what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'll do is come to each of the panel in turn. I'll just ask them to introduce themselves before they speak, rather than me running through that right now. Can I come to Sharmila, please?
Thank you very much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. I am Sharmila Nabrajani, and I am chairman of NICE. And Richard, you've asked us to think about barriers to access and then barriers to uptake. And I'm going to start with access first, and maybe we'll come back to uptake in the second round of questioning. The first question, I think, is why does speed of access matter? NICE has evaluated this year about 100 new active substances. That's about 70% more than we did 4 years ago. And if you look 4 years into the future, we can definitely see that the number of new active substances we will be called upon to evaluate is increasing, whether they are molecules, whether they are devices, or digital technologies. So there is a definite need for the organisation to streamline processes to create more capacity for the innovative medicines that you have just described, Richard. But speed matters most because the opportunity cost of any delay is not zero. Patients are waiting for those life-saving treatments. They are waiting for innovative medicines to make a difference to their lives, and the system needs those interventions at a price that the taxpayer can afford. So, with that in mind, at NICE we've done I'll highlight two things, and we may return to some things in questioning. The first is building on some of the lessons that came from the way in which we evaluated things within the pandemic timeframe. We have created a proportionate approach to HTA, a kind of test and learn, looking at different pilots to see how we can smooth the number of and accelerate the number of new active substances going through the system. And the first thing that we've done is we've designed the appraisal process so that it is proportionate to risk. So where we see molecules that we've seen before, or they are next in class, that we really make sure that the committee process is as streamlined as possible. We may only need one committee, particularly if the companies have got their data in good order. So for next-in-class and similar medicines, we're seeing an acceleration of something like 45% in the time it takes to get through the NICE system. The second thing that we're exploring is whether there are things that we can do that in rapid entry to market access to speed up for molecules that are plausibly innovative and clinically and cost effective, but where there is some uncertainty about capturing the data, getting those quickly into a managed access arrangement so that those innovations can get to patients quickly, and the system can learn what the likely plausible price point is going to be. And I think that is going to be another way in which we speed access to the system. And the final thing in the sort of proportionate approach is oftentimes we see for particular disease pathways, we see appraisals that come to us where we have seen much of the data before. And so we are exploring the idea of standardized models with pre-populated assumptions that again bring some standardization to the process, but also streamline and take essentially less time to go through the evaluative mechanism. So with all of those things, I think we will find a more agile, a more risk-based approach to medicines evaluation, and it should be quicker. The second thing I wanted to say about access is the work that we've done on severity modifier. And many of you listening on the call will be aware of this. We mooted it in our methods review about a year or so ago. And this event essentially says that for molecules, not just in the end of life, but where society believes them to be tackling severe disease, we will increase the willingness to pay thresholds. We're prepared to pay more for those. And I think we've had our first set of molecules come through that. We were going to evaluate it in the autumn, about 1 year after it's been in progress, and I am really hopeful that that will also address the other element of the access issue, which is the amount that the system is prepared to pay for particularly severe interventions. So maybe, Richard, I'll leave it at that point. Just the one last thing to say is you asked us to reflect on what we learned about taking an agile approach to regulation post-pandemic. I think one thing that we learned was how to establish committees in an agile way, looking at real-time evidence as it came in. But oddly, many of the things we see in normal time are different to the things that we saw in the wartime of the pandemic. For starters, there was not the evidence base that we have in diseases that we are now characterizing. So we've had to think quite hard about how we tackle that environment with evidence base. And the second thing, of course, is in the pandemic time, we were looking for things that were safe and plausibly clinically effective, but we didn't think about cost effectiveness at all. That was the kind of characteristic of the pandemic. So now we're having to think again about how we think about cost effectiveness of many of the molecules that were put in place in the pandemic. So some learnings, but some things very different.
Thank you very much, Sharmila. Can I come to Louise, please?
Yes, hi. So I'm Louise Fisher. I'm the Chief Executive at Genetic Alliance UK, and we are an alliance of over 230 patient charities and support groups that support people living with a really wide range of genetic, rare and undiagnosed conditions. And really, I just wanted to talk about some of the wider challenges alongside kind of the role that NICE plays in the speed of decision making, both by the MHRA and then NICE around innovative medicines. There are challenges for people living with rare and genetic conditions, particularly around getting diagnosis so that we know who the cohort of people are who could benefit from treatment with an innovative medicine. And rare diseases, we say they're individually rare, but they're collectively common. So there are around 6,000 rare diseases. Most of them affect anywhere between kind of 10,000 people in the UK to just 1, 2, or a handful of people around the world. But collectively, those conditions affect around 3.5 million people just here in the UK. So they really are individually rare, but collectively common. On average, it takes someone, because of the rarity of these conditions, 5 years from first talking to a healthcare professional about their symptoms starting to emerge to receiving a diagnosis. So I think there are potentially some ways for us to talk to colleagues at NICE about whether there's any learning we could take from the kind of approach they've taken to referral guidelines for suspected cancers, where they've looked at cancers as a group, or referral guidelines around groups of conditions like dementias? Is there any learning that could help GPs when they're presented with a patient who doesn't fit any of the common models of disease to think through where they should refer that patient? Often patients have very complex symptoms and they can bounce around kind of up to 30 appointments with different specialists before they happen upon the specialist who recognises their condition and understands what it is and can then put them on a pathway to management and support. So is there anything we can do with NICE or with NHS England or others to really understand what that referral pathway should be and help time-pressed GPs to kind of find their way through it? The other thing that we're really interested in is exploring how screening can play a role in that. And for many conditions, the earlier you're diagnosed, the faster you can get help. And if you think how frustrating it would be as an adult to wait 5 years for a diagnosis, imagine being a mum with a newborn baby, you know something's wrong, and it takes you 5 years in which your child is developing in all kind of vital ways where you don't know quite what from is and you can't get them the help that they need, which may be an innovative treatment. And in some cases, such treatment can be life-saving. They're certainly often life-changing. In some cases, it might be a referral to a physiotherapist or to a speech and language therapist to help a child with quite a complex condition communicate with the family and help them understand their needs from an early age. And that's just as important. So I think there's something about screening as well. And we're both interested in exploring how the newborn blood spot screening programme, which already has a heel prick test for every baby who's newborn in the UK. At the moment in the UK, we screen for up to 9 conditions, but in many European countries, they screen for up to 20. In the US, they screen for 59 conditions. Kind of how can we build on that very conventional technology? And we're also working with Genomics England, who are exploring a newborn screening project looking at whole genome sequencing for up to 200 different conditions with a clinical trial of around 100,000 newborn babies, again, to see is it possible to diagnose and get people support earlier. I suppose the final thing I wanted to say on behalf of the community I represent is that there are still only innovative medicines available for around 5% of rare conditions. So for the vast majority of people who we support, there isn't an innovative treatment yet. And it's been really welcome in the past week that both the MRC and the NIHR and LifeArc have announced quite big investments in rare disease medicines and in trying to translate some of the amazing scientific breakthroughs we're seeing through translational research into new medicines. So we hope that there'll be more new medicines coming along. And we really want to make sure through better screening and faster referrals and diagnosis that people will be able to benefit from those treatments as soon as possible to help them manage their condition. I was also just asked to reflect as well on the rapid rollout and the pandemic. And although it was amazing the way the NHS responded to the pandemic, there was a real opportunity cost to that. And what the NHS didn't do was both support people through the pandemic and manage its usual services, certainly for people with rare and genetic conditions in the usual way. So I think if we want to kind of really have the kind of pace of change we saw in the pandemic, we will need to create more headroom in the system in terms of both money and in terms of people to make that change possible and manage day-to-day care as it currently is, as well as driving improvements. I think it's really just important to be aware that it wasn't without cost, the focus on coronavirus.
Great, thank you, Louise. Can I come to Samantha, please?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm Sam Barber, and I'm Chief Executive of Gene People, and we do 3 main things. We have a genetic counsellor-led helpline, a partnership network of just over 140 condition-specific support groups, and we advocate and collaborate on behalf of that joint community. So I'm thinking about, it was very interesting to hear Louise speak. I think we're pretty aligned on many of the things that she was saying. So I'm thinking about those rare conditions, and as she said, there are thousands of them. There are fewer support groups, and please note that I'm saying support, not patient organisations, and I'll come on to why in a minute. And not all of those groups have ever gone through a health technology assessment. As Louise said, not all conditions have treatments. This means, and I don't want to use the word barrier, but challenge. There are challenges for those communities because we are involved in those appraisals and those assessments. It can mean that there's a lack of expertise within the organisation around those systems and the process. It could mean that there's a lack of evidence because you don't know what you're meant to be collecting until you're into that process. So, and you may not know that there's a treatment coming along. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to an organisation that was informed at the point of going to NICE. So that's a bit of a blip in the system, but it does happen. And also there can be a lack of capacity within an organisation. And I was reflecting again this morning that some of the condition support groups that we work with are actually completely voluntary. It's not just a volunteer board that's for the trustees, it's everyone in those organisations are volunteers, usually doing that work on top of caring for someone or living with a condition themselves. So there is a real capacity issue there. And it is a rigorous process. I experienced it myself as Chief Executive of the Batten Disease Family Association, and we secured a managed access agreement for the first ever treatment for any form of Batten disease. If you don't know Batten disease, it's a form of childhood dementia. And a managed access agreement in itself, although it gives access to the treatment, which is always welcome, it is by definition a process itself that has an endpoint. An endpoint which leads into another review of the new data as well as the previous data. For the Batten disease community, that process is happening next year, and having spoken to people involved in that organisation, it's creating anxiety within the community, which again is a challenge for both the organisation, the community, and also the system. And we talk a lot about, when we're thinking about appraisals, around managing uncertainty. And I really understand that, and I try to be sympathetic to it, but the ones who are actually facing the most uncertainty are the individuals with a condition and their families. They don't know how they're going to wake up in the morning, whether they're going to have a good day, whether they're going to have a bad day, whether they're going to have an episode of something that lands them in hospital. They don't know how their condition might progress because it's not a certainty what happens every day. And then there is an overlay of perhaps uncertainty around access to these wonderful treatments that are coming along. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty actually for the communities. I talked about condition-specific support groups rather than patient organisations, and Gene People really tries not to say patient and patient organisations because we feel that it's othering to people, and particularly during the pandemic we were all patients. So I think we have to remember that we're actually all humans, we're just experiencing different things. And I wanted to just reflect on the rationale for these condition-specific support groups. Because I think that is in itself also creates challenges for appraisals and assessments. Mostly the groups are individuals with a condition or parents, and they've been formed to support each other, peer-to-peer support, because there can be very little knowledge and information about a condition, how it might progress, how it might affect people, and best practice around it, just from the cohorts of people affected. So those people gather together, and it's pure voluntary action, it's wonderful, and some decide to fundraise for research. And I always say, and I will keep on saying this, that these groups are founded by hope and funded by love, because we don't receive government funding, we don't receive investor funding. We are seeking funding from other individuals who want, and organisations who believe in what we're doing and want to make a difference for our communities. And there's a case study that I just want to share, which is, and I'm not going to try the disease name, I'm afraid, because I'm going to mess it up and that would be insulting. So FOP Friends, FOP is a condition that is around about a 1 in a million occurrence, and it transforms the soft connective tissue into bone. FOP Friends is a UK organisation, completely voluntary, and they banded together with their global counterparts to fund academic research into the condition and into potential treatments for that condition. This has then springboarded, they were very successful in raising the money, and it's then springboarded into commercial research, and there are now several treatments in the pipeline. And when we're thinking about the barriers to treatment, there are people out there who are determined to do the best for their community. And these groups may be small, they might be lacking in capacity and resource, but they are a hugely important driver for change. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Can I come to Guy, please?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Guy Oliver. I'm the General Manager for Ipsen, UK and Ireland. And I think we've heard a lot around some of the challenges to access for innovative medicines. But if we think about the very earliest opportunity for patients in the UK to access innovative medicines, it's actually in clinical trials. And so this is an important opportunity for patients, particularly patients who don't have options currently, particularly patients with rare diseases. And currently, the situation in the UK is not a positive one. We've actually seen a decrease in the number of clinical trials over the last 5 years. So clinical trials have reduced by 41% over the last 5 years in the UK. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's really around resource. So I think we're all very acutely aware that the NHS is struggling. We have millions and millions of patients waiting for surgery, waiting for specialist care. It's exactly the same doctors and nurses who are treating patients on a daily basis who need to be running clinical trials. And we also know from a recent study by the King's Fund that the number of active practicing doctors and nurses that the UK has is a lot less per capita than other countries in Europe. So really, if we want to improve the number of clinical trials in the UK and therefore add additional opportunities for UK patients to access innovative medicines, we need to make sure that the NHS is resourced appropriately in order to be able to run clinical trials. So that's really critical. The other part of this is really thinking around how we compare internationally. So I work for a multinational international pharmaceutical company. We place clinical trials in countries. I represent the UK, and I fight every day to try and make sure that the UK has clinical trials placed within our country. But I'm competing against other countries, against Germany, France, the US, you name it. So we need to make sure that we're internationally competitive when it comes to speed of approvals for the clinical trials, speed of setup, and obviously execution of those trials, which means recruiting patients into those trials. And clinical trials are important for the patients who are in the trials, but also there's good data that shows that for clinicians who have been involved in a clinical trial, when that medicine comes onto the market, they're actually more comfortable and more able to use that medicine in normal clinical practice. So clinical trials benefits the patients in the trials, but also the wider patient population who can benefit from that medicine quicker once it is approved for use in the NHS. So I think definitely clinical trials is a big barrier for access to innovative medicines, and hopefully we can work on that in a cross-functional way. The other challenges we have, which haven't been touched on already, are around the MHRA. So the MHRA is our regulator in the UK. Post-Brexit is now a sovereign regulator, which is a huge opportunity for us. The MHRA has an ability to license medicines quicker than they could before when we were within the EU. However, the MHRA needs to be resourced appropriately. And as Shamila has said, we see an explosion and a tsunami of innovative medicines coming in the next few years, which is great news. But agencies like the MHRA and NICE need to be resourced appropriately to be able to assess those medicines quickly and get them to patients as quickly as possible. So I think I'll stop there, Richard, but that's a couple of the challenges we have for access for innovative medicines, maybe earlier on in the life cycle of a medicine than was previously discussed.
Great, thank you. And can I come to Richard, please?
Hi, yes. Welcome, everyone. Great to be joining you and great to be here representing the world of general practice. So I'm Richard Roop. I'm a GP in the South Coast and working at the Wessex Cancer Alliance Rapid Investigation Service and also one of their GP advisors. As we all know, the NHS is really stressed at the moment, and quite a lot of the things that we've been talking about actually impact on the speed of access to these amazing innovative drugs. And as Louise was saying, the early part of that pathway of where we can reach a diagnosis in timely fashion is hugely important. And if we as GPs are going to do our job properly, we do need more resourcing, more manpower, so that we can spend more time with patients. But what is really important is that if we can reach a diagnosis, whether it's in the area of these very rare conditions or actually even mainstream conditions, if we can make a diagnosis early, we have less consultations with patients. And actually, bizarrely, that then frees up time to deal with the long waits that a lot of folk are having to experience before seeing us. And we're really seeing the impact of the COVID legacy on delay to accessing surgery and so forth, in that it's us in primary care that are having to manage the symptoms of patients who are waiting for a year or more for surgery. And that just sort of cramps the system, removes that headspace, makes access more difficult, lengthens that access. And what we've learned from the NICE guidance on early recognition and diagnosis of cancer is that actually, as a profession, we can be equipped alongside our fellow clinicians to get patients to the right place at the right time, to see the right person, to get the right treatment in timely fashion. And if we do that, that actually takes a lot of pressure out of the whole system, in that you don't have patients sort of pinging around different departments, not making very satisfactory process in achieving that treatment. And particularly for young folk, but actually applies to all ages. In general practice, if we go back to what we learned in medical school, that if we've seen a patient 3 times and we're no further forward in reaching a diagnosis, we really need to be reaching out to our secondary care clinicians so that they can reach the patient, see the patient, and reach a diagnosis that much quicker. So there are lots of things to learn from COVID. One of the things that COVID bizarrely produced, as we effectively stopped doing a lot of services within that time, was we actually had headspace for a short period where we were able to introduce the vaccination program very quickly, and everyone just rose to the occasion. But I think, as Guy was saying, we have the lowest, or one of the lowest numbers of physicians and nurses per 1,000 population. If we had more, we would each have more headspace and could provide a more joined up and better service to our patients and enable that quicker route to diagnosis and accessing these innovative treatments. And I think I'll pass back to the other Richard.
Thank you very much. So what then can we do to improve uptake of new innovative medicines? To some extent, why isn't it already happening? And this is clearly coming through some of the questions I can see on the Q&A, also beginning to raise questions about what does need to be done to improve uptake. Can I come back to you, Richard, on that point?
Yeah, so I think we need I would say, a centralized database of what is available. For the rare conditions, it may be the case that a GP may not even see one in their whole career. But if there is that database of understanding where we can tap into, we also see inequalities as to where you might happen to live. So we know that those who live in very rural areas, it's harder for them to access the sort of quick pathways to get those treatments. And also just an issue of advocacy. We know that those who come from maybe a less affluent background, they may not be so good at advocacy in coming forward and getting that support to navigate the pathway to reach a diagnosis and access to those innovative medicines. So I think if we could have that sort of guidance that is easily accessible, where we know where to go. So although we may only see a condition once in a lifetime, once in a career, we know where to go to access that information at the earliest stage, so that we can route that patient to the right place at the right time, as I was saying earlier.
Great, thank you very much. Richard, can I come with the same question to Sam, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to flip Louise's stat on the head. Normally, I'm quite a positive person, and I say 5% of rare conditions have treatments, but actually that means that 95% do not. And that to me is a vast unmet need and inequality just in that sentence. So in terms of uptake, I think our helpline is hearing from people who want genetic testing. Obviously, there were issues during the pandemic because that resource was redeployed and everyone understood that. But there is a backlog and there is a lag. And that's come at the same time as there's been a lot of publicity around genomics and genetics. So the awareness of that strand of medicine is increasing. So that means that expectations have increased. So I think in terms of uptake of innovative medicines, there's people who would actually want to participate and want access, but they're falling at that first hurdle. They're not getting the testing. And that's just because of the system pressures we're under. And also, as Richard said, the system is made up of humans, so it depends on whether that clinician knows about your condition or not, or knows where to signpost you onto, which is an interesting point. Also, I'm thinking about the health technology appraisal process and how that can stimulate or not stimulate uptake. We live in a country that's actually 4 devolved nations with their own processes for appraisal and their own healthcare systems, and that immediately creates an inbuilt delay and inequity again. So you can have a situation where a treatment is available in one of the countries and not in the others. And that's divisive for the community around that condition, and also stimulates that inequity of uptake. And lastly, I just was reflecting on this morning. We are in the foothills of this revolution towards advanced therapies. And where we are now with this disparity and inequity of uptake, and actually the different conditions that have treatments or not, is not where we're going to be in 5 years' time. It will change quite rapidly, I think. But also, we need to allow people some time to adjust, to make sure that they are well informed about the advantages and disadvantages of participating in these treatments, and to adjust to that new reality. And the more that we can talk about the advantages and the advances of medicine in public, the better. But we just have to balance that with managing expectations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So can I come to Guy, please?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I think, and we've already heard a few potential solutions on how we can improve the situation. Clearly, a lot of it is around resourcing. So having an adequately resourced health service, but also adequately resourced agencies like the MHRA and NICE. And it's good to see things like the government's recent NHS workforce plan, but clearly that's going to take years and years or even decades to have the impact. So considering some other aspects, it's not just around access. So we've spoken a lot about access, but even once an innovative medicine has MHRA approval, NICE approval, and it's being rolled out in the UK, the actual uptake of that medicine is considerably slower than other countries. That's usually about 50 to 60% of the uptake compared to countries like Germany or France. And in fact, one example is in atrial fibrillation, which is a cardiovascular disease, which my company's not involved in, but it's a good example where all the guidance, the NICE guidelines, the clinical guidelines, all say that these patients should be on anticoagulation medicines. However, in the UK, only about a quarter of these patients are actually on anticoagulants. And the good research says that if all the patients were treated according to the guideline, then it would reduce the number of strokes by 7,000. So 7,000 strokes would be prevented, and 2,000 lives would be saved a year. So that's even for relatively cheap medicines that have been around for quite a long time. The actual uptake in the system is not working. So I guess the question is, what can we do about the uptake as well? And definitely in the UK, we have very decentralized care, which could be contributing to some of the disparity of uptake. But I think, as Richard said, it's really around capacity. So do our healthcare professionals have the capacity and the time to spend on their patients, to understand the guidelines, to understand the pathways, and to prescribe these medicines appropriately? And I think sometimes in the UK, we're very proud that our health service is efficient because we're using every last part of our health service. But actually, I think we need to change our mindset. And if we look at other health services around the world, they have extra capacity in their health service. And that was revealed during the COVID pandemic, where we already in the UK, the use of hospital beds was already at 99% plus. So we didn't have that capacity to take on our COVID patients. But in other countries like Germany, they run their health service about 80% capacity. So they've got that room for things like pandemics. But importantly, that room to innovate and to bring new medicines to patients, to diagnose those difficult rare diseases, and to learn how to use these new innovative medicines when they come. So I think it comes down to almost a societal debate around what do we want from our health service. And we spend less on our health service than other countries in Europe. And then when you look specifically at innovative medicines, for every £100 of GDP, the UK spends 81 pence on pharmaceuticals, whereas France spends £1.66 and Germany spends £1.98, so considerably more. And if you look at their whole health spend, we only spend 9% of our budget, of health budget, on medicines, whereas France and Germany spend more like 15-16%. So it's really a question we need to be asking ourselves as a society. Do we want to invest in health? Do we want to invest in innovative medicines? And my strong belief is that we should be, because it adds to the health of the country. We know that there are more patients waiting for treatment than ever before, but it also adds to the wealth of the country and adds to the productivity. And we know now there are more patients than ever before not working because of illness. So clearly, it's not just to help the health of the country, it's to help the wealth of the country as well. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. Sharmila, can I come to you, please?
Yes, thank you very much. And I reflect on the conversation of previous panel participants around the amount of money that we're prepared to invest in the health system. And that is, I think, a conversation for a wider societal debate. I mean, in my early remarks, I talked about some of the things that we're doing at NICE to speed up the access piece. But I think there is a second bunch of issues, which I signaled in my remarks, which is exactly this issue of how we accelerate uptake. And that is it's a live issue. It's a significant issue, as colleagues have talked about. NICE doesn't own all of the responsibility for doing that, of course, but we definitely understand that there are some critical things that we can do to help to move the dial. The first thing is we produce a lot of guidelines. It takes us a long time to produce those guidelines. They're incredibly rigorously produced with a great evidence base, but we are conscious that everything we produce lands in a health system where we've just heard resources are constrained, clinicians are tired. So if we are focusing very much on ensuring that when we update a guideline, we produce it in a way that makes it as easy as possible for clinicians to follow, and that we write it in as light touch a way so that it manages to cut through in a time when the system is so very under pressure. The second thing, which again is a learning from the pandemic, the work that was done in rapid COVID-19 guidelines, is that if we're producing a decision about an innovative molecule, we cannot wait 5 years for that to then be represented in the guidelines. So the NICE project that's looking at digital living guidelines will speed up the rate at which our guidelines can be updated for those areas of the disease burden which have the highest disease burden in the country. And I think that will be a significant way of helping to make the link between an innovative molecule that has got approval to be rolled out in the NHS, and then helping and supporting busy clinicians to integrate that into their practice along the clinical pathway. The third thing, I think, is on the basis of what gets measured, gets done, is helping ICSs and ICBs to understand in their regional areas, how is adoption going for these critical new molecules? And there, we have some data problems in that area in our country. And the approach we're taking in NICE is we write a guideline. And out of that guideline comes a quality standard, and out of that quality standard comes an indicator. Well, we can use that indicator and progress against that indicator, collect the data, and represent that back to ICSs and ICBs so that they can see in their region, are the standards being met for these key innovative developments? And if there is a regional or a postcode variation, we shine a light on that and enable ICSs and ICBs to tackle some of that disparity. So I think there's something around writing the guidelines in a light touch digital way, making sure they land with clinical communities in a way that they can do something because of them, that we write them quickly and update them quickly so we don't wait years for a guideline to be updated for an innovative molecule, and then we track adoption and present that data back to the system so that ICSs and ICBs can really start to move the dial on the variability. And I think those things will help. There's a whole piece of things of points I can see that are coming up in the questions, Richard, around ILAP and IDAP, and maybe we'll return to those sort of in open questions. I think there is also a really interesting debate about how some of those initiatives can help to increase both innovation access and then uptake, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. And can I come finally to Louise, please?
Yes, and I'm going to stick with the other end of the pathway around kind of uptake and kind of how the NHS responds. And I think that is a particular challenge for rare conditions where there often aren't clear pathways or services for many rare conditions. So there are, as we said earlier, around over 6,000 different rare conditions, and there are only around 80 specialised services which are commissioned centrally by NHS England through their specialised services manual, and they tend to be where there's less than 500 people a year with that condition. There are also some kind of more of the more common rare conditions, things like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell, where there are nice guidelines for them and they're commissioned more routinely across the NHS. But there are a whole host of rare conditions that fall in the middle. And it's not really clear at what level of the service they should be commissioned at. Should they be being commissioned by NHS England? Often the answer is no, because they're too large for NHS England. But, in the new system, should they be being commissioned by groups of ICSs? Should they be being commissioned by individual ICSs? Should they be being commissioned at a more local level? And actually what's often happening is they're not really being commissioned anywhere. And there are lots of rare conditions that are being run by kind of what we call grace and favour clinics, where luckily a keen clinician who is passionate about the condition will start running a service in the local hospital, start providing a service maybe once a month for people. They might get in touch with some other clinicians at a conference for that rare condition and kind of pull them into the fold. And it's all very kind of bottom up. And one of the challenges we have, and I'm sure GPs find the same challenges, is how do you identify and find that expertise? Because it's not mapped anywhere centrally. There's no central intelligence of where those services are, how you find those experts, how you refer to them. If they're not in your local ICS, then how do you know as a patient, as someone living with that condition, as a family member or as a GP, where to find and refer to a service where there may only be 4 people in the country with the expertise you need, and there's no central repository of database or information about how to find that person. So I think that's a massive challenge, and that's why we're really interested in doing some work with NHS England, with the integrated care systems, at mapping where that current expertise currently sits and really understanding what the pathways should be for those rare conditions. and also in spotting where the gaps are and where are their conditions, because we know from talking to our member organisations that there are lots of conditions where there isn't a clear service and there isn't a clear pathway, and we're not confident about the care that people with that condition are receiving. And the reason it matters, just to bring it back to uptake of innovative medicines, is because we're always running to catch up. NICE issues guidance on a new medicine, and then the NHS clicks into being, and it starts thinking about where the service is going to be for patients with that condition and how that medicine is going to reach them. And it can take 3, 4, 5 years to build up that service. And so it's understandable that the pharmaceutical industry is frustrated, because we're always running to try and catch up with where the technologies are coming, whereas actually the patients with that condition, the people living with that condition every day, they're already there. They already have those needs. Even when there's not a medicine available, it's almost more important that there's a service there to help them manage what are often very complex lifelong conditions. And if those services are there already and we're investing in them and making sure there's clear pathways to help people manage their condition, access the other things they need, like physiotherapy, speech and language therapy, support from different specialists working in a multidisciplinary team, if those services are there, then they can start to anticipate that NICE is starting work on a new medicine. They're starting to develop a technology appraisal. They can contribute their expertise to the appraisal of that medicine. They can start thinking how the service is going to respond to it. They can start thinking about clinical guidelines and how to work with NICE when a guideline comes out. But all of that needs to start with the person living with the condition and with their needs, not the other way around. And the system's kind of just pulled in the wrong direction the whole time by not starting with people first.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you to everyone for their thoughts so far. I'm just going to jump straight into some of the questions. Sharmila, you did mention briefly ILAP, that's the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway. There's also an Innovative Medicines Fund. How do you see these as being a help to improving access and uptake?
Yeah, I think they are, both of them are interesting developments. And ILAP, of course, has its sort of digital medtech sister, IDAP, which is going to be in the same space. And I think there are two things that are really interesting about that. The first is things like ILAP working across the boundary of MHRA and NICE. Data sharing between the two organisations enables that the analysis of safety and clinical and cost effectiveness, MHRA and NICE, to work in parallel. And I think in a way what that does, Louise, to your point, it speeds up the kind of parallel processing rather than always having to work in sequence. And what we're seeing from the early molecules that have come out of the ILAP process is that very soon after marketing authorization, sometimes at the point of marketing authorization, NICE is able to give a positive approval to that. So I think that will be a very helpful way of speeding up the access. The second point is about prioritization, and other colleagues on the panel have spoken very powerfully about that, and particularly how important it is to have the widest possible stakeholder group deciding on that prioritization. It's not just clinicians, but patients, carers, and wider society. And at NICE, we're setting up a common topic selection and prioritization board that will do exactly that. It will try and ensure that we are horizon scanning, looking at the advances that are likely to be the most both innovative and impactful, lining ourselves up against the MHRA and in time the FDA, so that the approval processes can work in sequence, in parallel rather than sequentially. And then critically, to that point about implementation, we can then also be signalling early to NHS England what is coming down the line, so that the implementation pieces can start to fall into place. And I think that will be another way of speeding up both access and, of course, uptake. An example would be the dementia drugs that, are coming our way. They are going to need, for example, significant upgrade in CT scan capacity. Patients are going to need lumbar puncture alongside that. The system has to be ready to provide those support alongside MHRA saying it's safe and NICE saying it's cost effective. And so I think that joining up of the prioritization informed by system intelligence and patient intelligence, I think will be an important catalyst to that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the questions, a very popular one, has been actually targeted at Guy. Guy, do you think Her Majesty's government is putting in place the resource that MHRA, that NICE and indeed the NHS need to try and improve access?
Good question. So, no, my answer is at this stage, no, right? I mean, I think we've been very clear today in the discussion that resourcing across the board is not appropriate. I think there's a desire potentially to do it, but we need to see that actually happen. And a good example is the recent resource for the MHRA, an additional £10 million of funding, which is great. But I believe that's a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed, given the tsunami of innovative medicines coming, given the opportunity we have post-Brexit, and given the learnings that we have from COVID, how we could accelerate approval and rollout of innovative medicines. But I think there's also a wider piece here, Richard, if I may, around the commercial environment for innovative medicines in the UK. So I said earlier today that as a UK representative of a global pharma company, I fight every day to allow my company to put trials in the UK. I also fight every day to allow us to launch medicines in the UK. And that fight is getting more and more difficult because if you're a global pharmaceutical company, you want to launch your medicines in a place where you can be assured of rapid approvals and rapid uptake of that medicine, and you'll prioritize those countries. And at the moment, the UK is not being prioritized, and we're seeing less medicines coming into the UK than in other countries across Europe or the States, for example. So there is an opportunity now, because there is the current voluntary agreement between the pharmaceutical industry and the government is being negotiated for the new agreement to start next year. And this includes a number of aspects around access to innovation. So how we can streamline access, how we can evolve the MHRA and NICE to accelerate access, but also how we can improve uptake. But at the same time, making sure that the UK has a sustainable commercial environment for companies like mine. And I believe if we get that right, then yes, companies like mine will bring their medicines to the UK. And yes, we will be able to get those medicines to British patients, UK patients who need them desperately. So I think, Richard, to answer your question, there is some desire from the government, but I think we really need to see that the proof's in the pudding. We need to see that in reality, and the level of ambition needs to be much, much greater if this government truly believes that innovative medicines can help our country's health and also help our country's wealth.
Great, thank you very much. Well, you mentioned the renegotiation of the agreement between the industry and government, which is underway. It used to be just a very narrow pricing negotiation, but now it's much broader, picking up issues around access, issues around uptake. Louise, if I could come to you, please. Is that agreement is renegotiated, or indeed more generally, what do you think needs to be in it? What's the biggest priority to try and get access and uptake at a better place in England?
In England, I mean, I think it is that balance between investment in MHRA and in NICE, and in the speed at which they can make decisions, and investment in the NHS to ensure that the NHS is ready and prepared for uptake of medicines. And I don't know, I have to admit, I'm not party to the VPAS discussions. We do have one of the team who's contributing to that conversation through the Charity Medicines Access Coalition. It's not something I've been involved in, but I think overall that balance between investment in the actual decision making around treatments and making sure that the NHS has the investment that it needs in terms of both money and people, and the headroom that I think everyone's talked about so eloquently, that question of having the extra space needed to innovate, to improve, to learn, to spend time on research. Whether that's a matter for VPAS, it's certainly a matter for the government to invest in all of those things if you're going to have an NHS that's actually going to be ready to meet the needs both of people with conditions, and to kind of realise the benefits and the promise of many of the innovative new medicines that are coming through. And for me, that access isn't quite, that balance isn't right at the moment. There's investment in the science is really great. You know, there's loads of investment in genomics and in research, and investment in the actual service is going to deliver the benefits to patients, either of research programs or day-to-day clinical practice, is just not matching it, and is meaning that we're falling down on actually making sure those benefits are realised for people. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that balance for me is wrong at the moment.
I think you did at that, certainly that global level, but I also know that Shamila wants to come in.
Oh, just one observation that that I think is worth thinking about. I mean, at the heart of this voluntary agreement is that there is a rebate that comes back from the companies back into the health system. And it seems to me that one of the advances that might really catalyse and accelerate the adoption of innovation is if that hypothecated money came back into innovative drugs. And so it's kind of, it doesn't change the size of the cake, but it does mean that people can see exactly what's happening to the rebate. It comes back into drugs. And of course, clinicians can see that they are getting that funding back into the system for the spending of innovative drugs. So just, you know, a thought that might be helpful.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm going to try and combine a group of questions to more general. There's lots of specific ones from, I suspect, from either from patients or from condition-specific support groups. And so I'm going to come to Samantha. I can see that weight that's coming through from all those different questions, but what is it that we need to do to try and support those condition-specific support groups? You're very eloquent about many of the challenges they face, and they're clearly a really key part of getting this wider environment to work.
Yes, I spotted that question too, particularly around the empowerment of support groups in this space. And I think it comes down to a number of things. I'm going to say resourcing. Most groups are not centrally funded or have any government funding. I'm a charity sector lifer, I've been in the voluntary sector for over 25 years. I really value our independence, but at some point, if we're being asked to participate in processes like the NICE process, then that some central funding would be nice to be able to access, no pun intended. I think there's also something around upskilling, and there's obviously Genetic Alliance, there's Gene People, there's Beacon for Rare, there's lots of infrastructure groups that can help the smaller groups, but in particular to upskill and develop their knowledge so that they are empowered around this area. One of the things, and Louise might want to chip in as well, is I don't feel that we've cracked the horizon scanning. I know that the healthcare system has a really good, strong horizon scanning capability, but as I said earlier, some of the groups are slightly taken aback when a treatment comes along, which puts them at a disadvantage. So there's something around collectively doing some horizon scanning and what can be shared and when it can be shared. So there's something that I'd like to crack there. And I also know that NICE in particular is doing some work around how they interact with condition-specific support groups and proportionate access to that system and that process. So I think there's lots of things happening, and I started my working life in the voluntary sector in marketing, and it comes back to a lot of this, to marketing and communications and funding. So it's those bedrock things that you don't think about when you set up a support group for your condition because you've just had a diagnosis. It's those bedrock things that need to be in place.
Thank you. And we are very, very nearly at time. But I just wanted very quickly, Richard, some of the questions are talking about compliance. So NICE may have issued a guideline, but how do we get clinicians to do it? If you could have one thing, what would it be to help a busy clinician actually take on board all the things that NICE are producing?
I guess it's time. It's having that headspace to actually have the time to read the guidelines. There are lots of streams of education, but if GPs are too busy to attend them and engage with them, that's a real challenge. I think the big picture, it's almost the elephant in the room, is that if we address prevention for those conditions that are preventable, we can reduce the volume of those to then give the space to deal with those conditions that are not preventable, that are genetic, and the rarer conditions. So if we address prevention, that perhaps is the new cure. But if we really address that, in the UK, we only spend 5% of the NHS budget on prevention. If we spend more on prevention, we can then spend more time and more of our resources on dealing with those conditions that are not preventable.
Great. Thank you very much. We are more or less at time, and apologies to all those who've been putting in questions. I know we've got a lot there. but time has slightly defeated us. But thank you very much to all of our people today on the panel, and thank you also for all those watching and adding in questions and taking part in the polls. Do remember you can share a link to this event with colleagues. They can register and watch on demand, so please do that. And also, if you could navigate to the feedback option in the menu on the left, we will send out a survey link in an email shortly, and we really value feedback to help us to improve our event. So thank you if you could take part in that. And just to finish again, thanks to our event sponsor, Ipsen. Thank you very much.